The days passed slowly. In Willow Bend, nothing seemed rushed. The river continued to flow, the trees moved gently in the wind, and the people carried on with their quiet routines. Everything felt the same. And yet, inside Elias's small cabin, something had begun to change. The wooden box on the table was no longer kept closed. It was opened almost every day now. New stories were being added. Old ones were being read again. The traveler was no longer just passing through. He stayed for a few days, then a few more, and after a while, he stopped talking about leaving at all. One morning, sunlight streamed softly through the window. Elias sat at the table, writing as usual. The traveler stepped inside, holding a few worn pieces of paper. "I found these," he said. Elias looked up. "Where?" "Behind the old church," the traveler replied. "They were buried just beneath the soil." Elias took the papers carefully. They were fragile, old enough that they almost felt like they might fall apart in his hands. He unfolded one slowly. Most of the writing had faded, but a few words remained. "These belong to someone from here," Elias said quietly. The traveler stood in silence. "So will you write them too?" he asked. Elias nodded. "As long as there are words," he said, "the story is still alive." From that day on, their work began to change. They weren't just writing new stories anymore. They were searching for the lost ones. Old houses, broken walls, memories buried beneath the earth. It was as if the past had been waiting patiently. Some of the townspeople didn't understand at first. "Why does any of this matter?" they asked. Elias would simply smile. "Because one day," he would say, "we all become stories." Slowly, things began to shift. People started coming on their own. One brought a letter from his grandfather. Another shared a childhood memory. Some would sit in silence at first, and then, after a while, begin to speak. The cabin was no longer just quiet. It was full of voices, of memories, of time itself. One evening, the traveler sat by the window. The sun was setting. Soft shades of red and orange stretched across the sky. "Do you ever wonder," he said, "how far these stories will go?" Elias fought for a moment. "Farther than we will," he said. The traveler smiled faintly. "And what if no one reads them?" Elias looked out at the river. It moved just as it always had. "Then they will still remain," he said. "Not every story is meant to be read. Some are simply meant to exist." Silence returned to the room, but it was no longer empty. It felt complete, like a long journey continuing without end. That night, Elias opened the wooden box again. There were more pages inside now, some new, some very old. He found a small empty space. Then he placed a fresh sheet of paper inside. At the top he wrote, "Stories of Willow Bend, ongoing." The traveler looked at it. "No ending?" he asked. Elias shook his head gently. "Stories don't end," he said. someone else just begins writing them. Outside, night had settled in. The stars returned to the sky. The river kept flowing, just as it always had. But now it carried more than water. It carried stories, slowly, quietly, endlessly. A gentle autumn breeze had begun to move through Willow Bend. The leaves on the trees were slowly changing from green to soft yellow to faded red. By the river, Elias sat in quiet stillness. The wooden box rested beside him. It no longer felt small. It felt like something deeper now, a quiet archive of time itself. The traveler stood a short distance away. He noticed something different. Elias seemed more thoughtful than usual. "Are you tired?" the traveler asked softly. Elias gave a faint smile. "No," he said, "just thinking." "About what?" Elias kept his eyes on the river. "These stories," he said, "they're not just the past, they're also the future." The traveler looked puzzled. "How?" Elias spoke slowly. "When someone hears a story, they remember it in their own way, and one day they tell it again." The traveler nodded. "So the stories change?" Elias turned slightly toward him. "Yes," he said, "but that's how they stay alive." A dry leaf drifted through the air. It landed gently on top of the wooden box. Elias picked it up. "Look at this," he said. "This leaf was once part of a tree. Now it's separate, but the story is still the same." The traveler remained quiet. Something in him shifted, a quiet understanding. Later that afternoon, they walked through the village. They stopped in front of an old house. It had been empty for years. The door hung slightly open. The windows were covered in dust. "Did someone live here?" the traveler asked. Elias nodded. "A long time ago," he said. "A teacher." They stepped inside. The floor creaked softly beneath their feet. Dust filled the air, and yet there was a strange sense of calm. In one corner stood an old table. A few books still rested on top. Elias opened one. Inside were small notes, names of children, simple lessons, half-finished thoughts. The traveler spoke quietly. "These were never finished." Elias looked at the pages. "Maybe someone will finish them," he said. They brought the book back with them. That night, Elias opened a fresh page. He began to write. A teacher who never finished his story. The traveler watched. "Are you finishing it for him?" he asked. Elias paused. Then he shook his head gently. "No," he said, "I'm just continuing it." Outside, the wind moved softly. Night slowly settled in. But inside the cabin, a light remained. Not just candlelight, something deeper. The light of stories, the light of time. One story giving rise to another, slowly,
quietly, without end. The traveler stood by the window. He looked out at the river. It flowed just as it always had, but now it felt different. Not just water, but movement, of memory, of voices, of unfinished words. Elias set his pen down. "Can you hear it?" he asked. The traveler listened. At first, no, he said. Elias closed his eyes. "The stories," he said softly, "inside the sound of the river." The traveler focused. At first there was only water, then something else, faint, distant, but present. He smiled slightly. "Yeah," he said, "I think I hear it now." Elias opened his eyes. There was a quiet peace in them. "Then you're part of it now," he said. The night deepened. The stars shone brighter. The river kept moving, and within it, countless stories, some remembered, some forgotten, some just beginning to return, slowly, quietly, endlessly.
Winter was slowly arriving in Willow Bend. The morning mist had grown thicker now. It drifted gently over the river, soft and white, as if time itself had slowed down. Elias woke before dawn. The cabin was still dark. The candlelight from the night before had long faded. He stepped outside quietly. The cold air met his face. Everything was still. No sound except the faint, distant movement of the river. The traveler was still asleep. Elias began walking alone toward the water. Each step was slow. Leaves and frost softened the ground beneath his feet. It didn't feel like he was going anywhere in particular, just moving gently through time. When he reached the river, he stopped. Something felt different. The water moved as it always had, but the sound was softer, quieter. Elias closed his eyes. He stood there for a while. Then, slowly, he sat down. Time passed. The sun had not yet fully risen. And then he heard something, very faint, like a voice. Elias opened his eyes. There was no one there, only mist and the river. He listened carefully. The sound came again, this time a little clearer. But it wasn't a single voice. It was many, distant, ancient, layered together. Elias spoke softly. "I hear you." The air shifted slightly. The surface of the river trembled. Something moved within the mist. Just then, the traveler approached. "You're out here?" he asked quietly. Elias didn't look away from the water. "Can you hear it?" he asked. The traveler stood still. He listened. At first, nothing. Then, something faint, like whispers, unclear, but present. "What is that?" he asked. Elias answered slowly, "They're stories that haven't been written yet." The traveler's eyes widened slightly. "Not written yet?" Elias nodded. "Not all stories belong to the past," he said. "Some of them are still waiting." The mist began to lift. Soft light from the rising sun spread across the river. The water became clearer again, but the sound, it was still there. The traveler sat down beside him. "So, do we write those too?" he asked. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled gently. "No," he said, "we don't write those. We listen." The cold air lingered. Silence settled around them again. But it wasn't empty. The river flowed on, carrying past, present, and future together, slowly, quietly, unseen. From that day on, their work changed again. They didn't just write stories. They waited. They listened for the ones that had not yet arrived. That night, Elias opened the wooden box once more. He took out a fresh sheet of paper. For a moment, he simply held the pen. Then he wrote, "Today we heard a story that has no words yet." The traveler looked at him. "A story without words?" he asked. Elias nodded. "The deepest stories," he said softly, "begin in silence." Outside, night had fallen. The stars returned to the sky. But now, even their light felt like it carried something. The traveler stood by the window. He looked up. It felt like the stories were not only in the river, but in the sky, in the air, in every quiet moment. Elias closed the box gently. "Tomorrow," he said, "we listen again."
The next day, something had changed. Not in a way that could be easily seen. It was quieter than that, subtle, like something had gently settled into place. The morning was unusually clear, no mist. The sky stretched open and blue. The river moved with a quiet clarity. Elias stood outside. There was a calm in his eyes, deeper than before. The traveler walked up beside him. He didn't speak. He just stood there, looking at the river. After a while, Elias said softly, "Do you notice it?" The traveler paused. "What?" he asked. Elias kept his gaze on the water. "The river," he said. "It isn't saying anything today." The traveler listened carefully. There were no whispers, no distant voices, no echoes of the past, no waiting stories, only the quiet movement of water. "Is it over?" the traveler asked. Elias was silent for a moment. Then he shook his head gently. "No," he said, "it isn't over." He took a slow breath. "This is completion." The traveler looked at him. "Completion?"
Elias nodded. When every story has been heard, when every voice has rested, he said, what remains is simply being. The river flowed on, without urgency, without memory, without expectation, just present. The traveler slowly sat down by the water. He closed his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't searching. He wasn't trying to listen. He wasn't trying to understand. He was simply there. Elias watched him. After that night, Willow Bend grew even quieter. Not an ordinary kind of silence. This was the kind of silence where even sound seemed to rest. Morning came slowly. The sky was gray. The sun felt distant, as if it had no reason to hurry. Elias sat by the window. The wooden box rested in front of him, but today he didn't open it. He simply looked at it, as if waiting for something to arrive on its own. The traveler slowly woke. The room was dim. He stood there for a moment in silence. Then he asked softly, "Are we not writing today?" Elias shook his head. "No," he said gently. "Today we just stay." The traveler frowned slightly. "Just stay?" Elias smiled faintly. "Yes," he said. "Not everything needs to be done." Silence returned to the room, but it wasn't heavy. It was calm. They stepped outside. The air was still. The trees did not move. Even the river flowed more slowly, as if everything had paused for a moment. The traveler looked at the water. It felt like the river was looking back at him. After a while he spoke. "Have you ever wanted to step into the river?" Elias turned to him. "Long ago," he said, "but I didn't understand then." He paused. "There's no need to step in." The traveler was quiet. "Why?" he asked. Elias looked out across the water. "Because," he said slowly, "we're already inside it." Something shifted in the air. The traveler didn't respond. He just stood there, watching the river. And for the first time, it felt like he understood. The day passed slowly. They didn't write anything. They didn't open old pages. They didn't search for memories. They simply sat, walked, watched, listened. Nothing more. Evening came. Clouds. The final night felt unusually soft. There was no weight to it, no waiting, only a deep, complete stillness. Elias and the traveler were both awake, but they didn't speak. There was no need. Inside the cabin, The fire had nearly faded. A soft red glow moved gently across the wooden walls. Outside, the river continued to flow, so quietly it almost felt still, as if it was no longer moving forward, but simply existing. The traveler slowly stood up. He walked to the door, then stepped outside. The night was clear. The sky was filled with stars. Their light reflected on the river, forming a soft, shifting glow. Elias followed him. They stood together by the water. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, the traveler asked, "Is this the end?" Elias kept his eyes on the river. There was no sadness in them, no excitement either, only peace. "The end," he said slowly. "Maybe not." He paused. "But for us, this is enough." The traveler nodded. He understood. Not everything needs to end. Some things simply become complete. The air was still. The river moved gently. There were no voices now, no stories waiting, no echoes of the past, only being. The traveler sat down by the water. He looked into it. There were no thoughts in his expression, no questions, no searching, only presence. Elias stood beside him. Then, after a